Great pleasure to see 81 people, at least bright and early on a Tuesday morning here on the East Coast of the United States. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to all of our friends from Europe. Looking through this list, we have lots of Europeans participating. We're very pleased. I'm Nick Burns, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's a great pleasure for me to see on this Zoom screen Professor Sergio Fabbrini, Ambassador Alvaro Renedo. Both of them, as you know, have been fellows with us at the Harvard Kennedy School for the past several months. Both of them made the right decision to go home and to be with their families. Sergio in Italy and Rome, and now in northern Italy. Alvaro to Madrid, but then to Andalusia with his family. In a better world, we would all be together in some seminar room at Harvard University, but none of us has even stepped into the university, I think, since March 12th or 13th. So we do our best on Zoom, on this platform. And what we thought we'd do this morning is that I would ask Alvaro and Sergio a few questions. And the subject is, what do they think will be the impact of the coronavirus and the economic collapse, and there's really no other word for it globally, on the European Union, on the way that European citizens feel about the European Union? Will we see a return, are we to nationalism and a return to a stronger nation state vis-a-vis Brussels within the EU itself? We'll have that conversation. I'll ask them 4 or 5 questions, then we'll open it up. I think everybody by now knows Zoom protocol. When we get to the question and answer period, simply press the blue hand button. And I will recognize people in the order in which the questions were asked. We'll get as many questions in as we can. We will go for the next hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes. For those of us who can stay with us, I wanted to thank Erica Meneselis for organizing this meeting. I wanted to thank Catherine Kluver and Jonathan, who is appearing on screen, her son. Welcome, Jonathan, this morning. I hope we can hear from him. I want to welcome the great Carl Kaiser from a beautiful room in New Hampshire. Carl, nice to see you. I want to welcome Julian Howarth, who in a better world would be with us in a classroom too, and we're glad that he's back. All of our friends from around the world. So Sergio and Alvaro, welcome. We hope that you and your families are both well. I thought we'd start, as we agreed, maybe Sergio, starting with you. Tell us about the situation in Italy, especially in northern Italy. How are people coping? Is there now a little bit more hope that you're past the worst? And all of us have so much sympathy for what happened to Italy and what happened to Spain. Sergio, please.
Thanks. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to do this seminar with you at the Kennedy School. So the situation now in Italy is, as people say, the curve is flattering. However, it's still alarming. In particular, in North Italy, the hospitals are still in a situation of stress. There is the mood that Italy had difficulty at the very beginning to realize the complexity of the challenge, and also that the institutional machinery of the Italian state didn't work properly because it was not clear the distribution of responsibility between the regions and Rome and the central state. In Italy, health policy is pertain to the region, so it's probably the most important policy that the region manage. And so the region tried to answer according to their own idiosyncratic logic. But of course, there is also the fact that a challenge like the coronavirus require a national answer, and of course a European answer. So there was a conflict between the region, in particular between Lombardy and the central state, the national government. And also it appeared that the health policy model adopted in Lombardy did not fare well in facing this challenge. Lombardy is one of the most advanced health public system in Europe. and Lombardy is one of the richest regions in Europe. Nevertheless, they concentrated more on hospitalization rather than on organizing territorial, let's say, organization of health and hospital and medical doctors. So everything has been centralized in Milan. And so when the coronavirus exploded, all the people were obliged to go to Milan, in the hospital in Milan, and that helped the diffusion of the virus. So in a way, I would say now the system is reacting quite well. We have a public system with only one public option, to use the American electoral debate. So we have Medicare for all, and the system, I think, works quite effectively, but still there are institutional issues that need to be resolved after this question, namely the capacity of the central government to impose its own policy in situation of emergency over the region.
Sergio, thank you very much for that. Alvaro, before we ask you about the situation in Spain, you know, one thing, as I scroll through the images here, I failed to see Professor Vivian Schmidt, who is here from Boston University. So we're pleased to have Vivian here. I failed to see Fran Ulmar, Suvi Sapalainen, our former student here, who is now working for the European External Action Service, Anna Stansbury, PhD candidate at Harvard, former teaching assistants. I want to welcome all of you. Alvaro, the situation in Spain, what can you tell us about how people are coping, how the government is coping, and about the future?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Burns, Professor Fabbrini. Good morning to everyone in the US. Good afternoon in Europe. It is a pleasure to speak to you today, even if we are living somber times. The topic couldn't be more pressing, and our moderator and my fellow panelists more authoritative. We're living very trying times in Europe, in Spain, in Italy, and the US. In Spain, we have over 200,000 confirmed cases, COVID-19, a death toll of over 20,000. Our state of emergency have been prolonged until May. However, we are looking towards the future with optimism. We have over 82,000 people that have overcome COVID-19. And the curve, as in Italy, as in other places, fortunately, is flattening. So now is the time to work within the European Union to address this challenge collectively.
Alvaro, thank you. I can just report there are a lot of us here living in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Talking to medical people last night, Massachusetts is now at the apex. And it's unfortunately, one of the hotspots in the United States. Our hospitals are literally full. The ICU units, the intensive care units are full at most of our hospitals. I want to ask this question with some sensitivity. I want to group the United States with Italy and Spain. At some point, do the Italians, Spaniards, and Americans need to debate what went wrong? Why was it that, I will just speak as an American, the United States was so unprepared for this crisis? I suppose we're going to have to convene a 9/11 style commission. Now is not the right time. Maybe in the next 6 to 12 months, what went wrong? Particularly in the inability of the federal government to work effectively with our states. Are you beginning to debate that in Italy and Spain? Do you think there'll be formal commissions? Because if you compare the United States to South Korea, or you compare Italy and Spain to Germany, very different reactions. And at least so far, you have to give the German government credit and the German public health system. We Americans have to look outside and learn from others what to do well. Are you starting to debate that in your two countries?
Yes. Let's say first, there is a debate on the nature of the pandemic and how to evaluate this crisis. I think there is in Europe a division on the interpretation of the magnitude and the implication of the crisis. For a group of countries, or for the leader of a group of countries, in particular in the north, this is an ordinary crisis, if I can say like that. which follow the euro crisis, the migration crisis, the security crisis. So is a crisis that should be dealt with domestic resources, institutions, forces, and instruments. So is an exogenous crisis, but a crisis that should be dealt through endogenous, let's say, resources. This is the interpretation, the paradigm that was introduced with the euro crisis. If you are not able to answer the crisis, it is up to you. This is your responsibility. So we can help you through the European Stability Mechanism, for example, but you have to pay conditionality in order to have that support. There is another group of countries and the group of leaders that think that this is not the case. Probably was not the case in the previous crisis, but certainly is not the case for this crisis. This is an existential crisis, is a symmetric crisis that affects everybody, although it has asymmetric effect. It impinges upon Italy or Spain or France more than Germany. And Germany, of course, because arrived later, could learn from the Italian and Spanish experience in order to introduce immediate control on the population to prepare the health system. So for this group of countries, this crisis is a let's say, is a structural crisis, is a window of opportunity, is a historical point, is like the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Europe emerging from this crisis will not be the same of the Europe before the crisis. So, and that is a debate. For example, this position is clearly expressed by Mr. Macron, where the previous position is clearly expressed by the Prime Minister of Netherlands, Mr. Rutte. So, of course, the interpretation of the crisis affect the instrument that you can utilize for dealing with the crisis. For Rutte, we have to go back to the European Stability Mechanism. For Macron, but then also for the Spaniard and the Italian government, and for other 9 governments in Europe, basically of the South, this is not sufficient. By the way, it seems to see a sort of a new division in Europe between the Catholic South and the Protestant North, as it is really astonishing to my view to see this cleavage. Anyway, the South say, no, we have to look for new instruments. We have to set up a new European Union. And that, I think, is something very significant. So coronavirus create a lot of trouble and dramatic existential cost, but oblige Europeans to face their own responsibility about the future of Europe.
Sergio, thank you. Alvaro, this question, do we need to tell each other some hard truths inside Italy, Spain, the United States about what went wrong?
Well, there is an intense debate in public opinion, and there is a growing sense of awareness that it is crucial for member states and the EU as such to improve preparedness for future infectious disease outbreaks. I mean, COVID-19 will definitely not be the last pandemic. And in a nutshell, people are realizing that more effective concerted EU action is needed in order to face effectively the twin crises that have emerged, the health crisis and the economic crisis. And with regard to the health crisis, the EU should have a more effective role in public health. I mean, we can talk about the limits of the EU in this policy field. The steps taken the last month to use the EU's collective purchasing power, for example, to bulk order face masks, protective gear, ventilators, should be turned into a permanent role in ensuring stockpiles of emergency supplies, such as the EU requires, by the way, member countries keep oil reserves that can last at least 3 months. We have a European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, whose remit must be extended and budget and personnel beefed up. And there's also an awareness that A smarter use of technology, robotics, artificial intelligence must be fostered. Now, working closely with the WHO, the European Center for Disease Prevention should be given a greater mandate on preparedness, planning, scientific advice, surveillance. I was reading yesterday a great piece published in Harvard Business Review, by the way, by MIT researcher Mason Yoon on COVID-19 digital tracing. And that's had a lot of resonance here in Europe. Of course, this is very tricky. Yuval Noah Harari has warned us that we may be living a watershed in the history of surveillance. And we have to really closely define, target, and time limit, subject to independent scrutiny, any surveillance. But the trickiest part, in my modest opinion, in the short run, will be how to coordinate the European Union and the Commission's role in the economy. And I am sure that post-COVID-19 Europe will require a more directive role in the economy. And I'm not saying that we have to revive Gosplan, the Soviet-era central planning agency, but we have to have a leading role of the Commission in reducing overcapacity and overseeing an orderly exit from the crisis. Now, major concerted action by the Commission will be needed to prop up and potentially restructure sectors which today face huge survival challenges. Airlines, auto manufacturers, tourism. I mean, so many companies have been forced to halt their activities. And Nick, we have important historical examples of leadership by the Commission for similar purposes. In the 1970s, during the energy crises, we had the Commission that deployed the Davignon Plan, which restructured and shrank European steel industry, ending a ruinous subsidy race. After the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, initial reaction among European Western leaders was absolutely disorderly among the then 20-nation European community. And the Commission President Jacques Delors brought forward an existing proposal for a single currency as a common response to the crisis. And in a completely different context, when the September 11th terrorist attack struck the US, the Commission pulled out stalled plans for a European arrest warrant to replace lengthy and inefficient extradition procedures among European countries as a European answer to fight terrorism. And Spain had a lot to do with that because we were the presidents of the European Union in 2002. So, I mean, in a post-COVID-19 Europe, without joint European action, the risk is that large and rich member countries bail out their own airlines and car makers, while poor and small countries struggle, leading to massive distortions and competition within the EU and internationally. And this could unleash a fire sale in Italy, in Spain, also in Germany, of fundamentally sound companies, distressed due to sudden economic shock. And I mean, we have, in Spain, for example, we have Africa, we're a frontline external border country. And lessons learned from past crises show us that helping our neighbors is helping ourselves. And this begins with Africa, but also with Turkey, with the Balkans. I mean, we have in Turkey over 4 million Syrian refugees cramped in camps where the virus could easily propagate. In Moria camp in the Greek island of Lesbos, for example, where my wife worked as volunteer, there are 205,000 people per square kilometer. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you, Nick, when you said yesterday in class that the EU's action, humanitarian action towards Africa, towards its neighborhood, is a geopolitical must for Europe as a whole. So that's my view.
Thank you, Alvaro. Thank you, Sergio. I'm just going to ask two more questions and let's open it up. The first question has to do with how people are going to react emotionally, personally, politically. I'm assuming, I could be wrong about this, that in the United States, a lot of Americans are going to look at what happened to us and say, we need a stronger social safety net. We need health insurance not attached to a job, but attached to the person. Basic economic rights to survive a cataclysm of the type that we're going through with the pandemic and the global economic collapse and the economic collapse in the United States. 22 million people on the unemployed rolls in 4 weeks in our country. And I'm wondering if you think there's going to be that type of reaction in Europe. My class last night, Great Powers, a lot of European students, 16 countries represented from all around the world. We surveyed the reactions of all the largest powers, China, the United States, Europe, Russia, Japan, other countries, to these two crises. And my students almost universally described the European Union as not effective, that the nation state had reappeared in Europe. Now that maybe we're not understanding it, maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but as you begin to debate the solutions in Europe, will citizens look towards their national capitals, or will they look towards Brussels? Is it possible to answer that question? Sergio.
Well, the European Union is a kind of hybrid organization. We have a highly integrated single market. And I would say that in the single market, you have a sort of quasi-federal type of decision-making. The Commission is quite powerful and submit proposal, directive, regulation to either the Parliament or the Council of Ministers. But in the so-called core state power policy, like defense, foreign policy, security, intelligence, migration, but more, of course, economic policy, the budgetary fiscal policy, the European Union is a sort of confederation, to use the American example. Here, decisions are taken through unanimity, and is the classical example of reciprocal veto, in which countries have difficulty to take a decision through consensus. So this is why in this crucial policy, Europe tend to arrive too late and with too little impact. So this was the experience of the 2000s, the last decade. Apparently, this time, after a very, incomprehensible period in which the Commission and the other national government did not understand what the situation was taking place in Italy and then in Spain, this time they were able to take important decisions. They, for example, they abolished or they suspended the Stability and Growth Pact that imposed tight constraint on the use of public expenditure. They relaxed the so-called rule on state aid. So now the national government can intervene to help national industry. They also inaugurate a new program for supporting unemployment generated by the crisis, and they also reduce the conditionality of the European Stability Mechanism, creating a special credit line of the European Stability Mechanism for supporting member states fighting the effect of the coronavirus with a very limited constraint. However, so this time was not too late, although probably is yet too little. However, this approach is approach based on loans. So again, as it happened in the previous crisis, I call this the coalition in favor of loans. As it happened in the previous crisis, this institution give money to the member state for dealing with the effect of the virus, but then they have to repay, although to a very favorable condition, probably with a longer period of deadline of those loans. But yet, we are in this situation. So if you rely exclusively on loan, the situation might be the following, that after the coronavirus, the southern member state must eat it without any responsibilities. This crisis is not the responsibility of the Italian government, of the Spanish government, or the French. It's just a chance that started in the south of Italy. So without responsibility, they will find themselves in the condition to support an economic recovery with already a public budget, let's say, overwhelmed, overweighted by also repaying the loans, the interest rate on the loans received. So that create a very favorable condition for the northern countries. So they can come out from the crisis with larger chances to invest in development, in reconstruction, in new activity, in Green Deal, and the difference between the north and the south would increase. And that difference might jeopardize the stability and the viability of the same single market. So here you have the classical line. So, and then the southern member states reacted powerfully, because if we are going to have difficulty in recovering, then nationalist forces from Salvini in Italy to Marine Le Pen in France would say, but why we have to stay within a system that constrains us without helping us? So nationalism is around the corner. And I think the possibility for nationalists to go to the government, particularly in Italy and France, might be very high with this loan strategy. From this perception, from this awareness, has emerged the idea that you cannot come out from this crisis through loans, but you need grants. You need a European Union public debt, as Alvaro said before, supported and guaranteed by the multi-annual financial budget of the European Union, going to the market, get the money, and managing the money through the Commission under the control of the Parliament and the Council of Ministers, but that money should be invested as a grant. And here again, this is for those of us who knows American federalism, this is very clear. The US federalism is an example of the gradual transformation of a policy based on loans towards a policy based on grants, especially in moment of crisis. So, and this is the question of the Eurobond, or it doesn't matter, you can find your name, but only if you receive grants, Italy, Spain, France can emerge from the virus, from the pandemics, with the possibility to recover economically, and without asking people to make further sacrifice. And the experience of Greece, the beginning of the 2000s, is there. This is why people don't want European stability mechanism, because Greece was put in the condition to starve on those conditionality. This doesn't mean that Greece didn't have, or the Greece political elite didn't have his own responsibility, but this is not a reason for making people suffering as it happened in that country. So this is a battle on the future of Europe. Either you have a Europe of nation state coordinating, so I can help you if you need, but you have to repay the loans that I give you, or you have a union which has a political identity. So he has a budget, and he has the capacity to have taxes, with that taxes to answer to the asymmetric effect of this symmetric crisis. This is a battle about the soul of the European Union. It's not just a battle on policy question. Is, do we want to have, as Alvaro said before, a commission strengthened in managing this budget and helping this economy to come out from the pandemics with the resource that should not be repaid, because if you have to repay those resources, you are done. And the pressure for going back, for exiting the euro, probably even for exiting the European Union, will be dramatic. So this is so to push for having a European Union public debt, as you have in the US, guaranteed by European Union institution, is a condition for preventing nationalists to become the majority in the Southern European countries.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Alvaro, last word, and then we're going to go to questions. Whoever would like to ask a question, just the blue hand button. I'll recognize people as they come along. Alvaro, is it going to be the European Council is meeting Thursday? Very important meeting to discuss debt mutualization, among other issues. Is it going to be grants? Is it going to be loans? Sergio has broken down the sides. Is it going to be a Europe of nation states? Is there any hope of an ever closer union, or is that dead as a sentiment in Europe? Your thoughts on this, Alvaro?
Well, it's the million-dollar question. As in other moments of crisis throughout history, COVID-19 has unleashed at its initial stage national forces and inward-looking reactions. This is understandable in a similar way that we've commented this before. When an aircraft cabin becomes depressurized, people must first put on their masks before helping other people around them to put on theirs. The nation state is still the core actor and unit in international society and public international law. And the European Union is no exception. At the first stage of the COVID-19 crisis, European national leaders seeking to protect their citizens ordered unilateral border closures and export bans on medical equipment that temporarily upended the Schengen area and the single market. Of course, this was done in accordance with EU law, Article 28 of the Border Code, but the ensuing problem was the unorderly reactions to the pandemic, rightly perceived as haphazard. I mean, certain countries imposed total lockdowns while others left their citizens relatively free to roam. So this national dominance of the first stage of the crisis management was absolutely dysfunctional, as a cross-border challenge like the COVID-19 requires effective cross-border coordination. And why has this lack of coordination been possible? The short answer is that the EU is not a superstate, as hinted by Professor Fabbrini. It is the most sophisticated organization of supernatural integration in the history of mankind, however, still today in constant evolution. And the EU has numerous shortcomings, or to put it more diplomatically, inbuilt limitations that curtail the EU's role as a political actor. The EU has limited powers in public health and can only supplement or complement the member state. These limited powers have impeded comprehensive and swift responses to an implacable challenge that at the end of the day offers no grace period nor clemency for belated decision-making. In the face of crisis, and I've lived this firsthand before when I was in the president's office, the EU is trapped owing to its limited powers, precisely in policy fields where powers are more necessary. And furthermore, these limited powers have been frequently bogged down by divisions and skirmishes among member states, owing to complex and dysfunctional decision-making processes that hinge, as Professor Fabbrini underlined, on the constant need to reach consensus. While Professor Fabbrini was speaking, Henry Kissinger's reflection came to mind on the impact of bureaucratic structures on foreign policy. According to Dr. Kissinger, decision-making can grow so complex that the process of producing a bureaucratic consensus may overshadow the purpose of the effort. And this is the consensus trap in which the EU constantly finds itself. Former Eurogroup Secretary Thomas Wieser was declaring a few days ago, glaringly, that in the EU, economically we are one, but overall politics have remained national. The EU has not been able to overcome its original founding alliance, the European Economic Community. In spite of unprecedented level of integration obtained in important policy fields, such as trade or competition, many other policy fields are, by and large, still in the hands of member states. Public health, foreign policy are but two examples of key policy areas in which the EU must enhance its powers if it wants to perform effectively. And unfortunately, and I'll end with this, I must admit that the EU has fallen in the eyes of many citizens. It has been harshly criticized the initial European reaction, how it's been so limited when we should be at our finest hour. And President Macron went as far as saying that the EU faces an existential threat. And I must say, I must agree with him. As a consequence of the crisis, a sense of betrayal has deepened among citizens from the most affected countries. like Italy or Spain. In a survey conducted recently in Italy, 60, I think it was close to 70% of respondents said that they believed being part of the EU was a disadvantage to the country, up from close to 50% in 2018. And I was reading that former Prime Minister Enrico Letta, with whom I had the honor to work with, was warning that if the EU did not support Italy enough, the country could become the Hungary of the Eurozone, a troublemaker railing against the mainstream inside the bloc's single currency zone. And this, of course, is not new. We had dwindling public support to the EU during the economic and financial crisis, which started in 2008. But there are two main differences now. Unlike in the years after 2008, public opinion today is now fully aware, as a consequence of Brexit, that it is not impossible to withdraw from the European Union. And Eurosceptical populist parties have continued to mushroom, as Pippa Norris and Ronald Ingerkart have eloquently substantiated. So I believe that by watering down the ambition and solidarity of its response to COVID-19 crisis, the EU has played with fire. And hopefully Thursday's European Council may, according to its mandate, Article 15, give the Union the necessary impetus for its development. But I would be cautiously skeptical in the sense that in the European Council, consensus is needed, and we are frequently victims of the so-called consensus trap.
Alvaro, thank you. Sergio, thank you. We're through with the interview portion of this session. Thanks very much. We're going to go to participants, to attendees to ask questions. I would just ask for short questions, short answers. We'll get through as many of these as we can. We're also looking on chat, which is a really nice feature of Zoom. And I see on chat that Bernard Hudson asked a question that is a good one. In addition to the North-South difference in perspective response, could someone speak to the East-West differences within the EU? We'll get to that, but let me ask Romain de Saint-Perrier, one of our students, to ask the first question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I am a student at the Kennedy School. Before the crisis, the Commission had an ambitious roadmap, an ambitious agenda for the European Union, like European defense projects. What do you think will be the biggest losers or the biggest winners for the European Union because of this crisis, in terms of the normal agenda that was set before the crisis?
Which of you would like to answer that?
Alvaro, this is for you. Alvaro, this is for you.
Well, I believe that COVID-19 is the epitome of a challenge in which common EU action affords absolute gains for everyone. I mean, I admit that the EU had a rough start in its fight against the pandemic, but it has time to rally. And I think it's too early to talk about winners and losers. Being a Spaniard and speaking along with a distinguished Italian, please allow me to recur to a soccer or calcio metaphor. Throughout history, when dealing with crises, the EU has usually acted like an ill-disciplined soccer team that often goes a few goals down at the start of a crisis, only to snatch victory in the second half, once it starts to really play like a team. And I mean, let's just hope that it's not too little and too late, as Professor Fabbrini said, but a stronger Commission and a stronger common EU response will afford gains economic, public health-wise for all the member states, and even for the credibility and the soft power of the European project as a whole, which once again will be absolutely beneficial for all of its member states. Perhaps Professor Fabbrini could add some comments.
It's fine.
Sergio, I'd like to ask you a different question. Actually, I'm not asking it. It's Karsten Bresky on chat. Two-part question for you, Sergio. He says, hi, Sergio. I understand there's been a stigma to an ESM loan, but the conditions have been watered down. There's the European Central Bank buying government bonds. There's a waiver of the fiscal rules. So why is Italy not doing more fiscal stimulus to support your recovery? And then he asks in a separate chat post, to add to the question, couldn't the Italian government simply increase spending now and use this as bargaining power later on, rather than pushing for Corona bonds now, but running the risk of pushing its economy further into recession. I know you're not a professor of economics, but you're a very smart guy. So Karsten's asked a really challenging question.
Karsten, yes. Italy is right now, before the coronavirus, a public debt of 135 versus the GDP. So for Italy to increase dramatically its own fiscal stimulus, so to go to the market for getting money might be very dangerous. This is why we need to be covered. Of course, this time we have the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank has entered the game, very powerful, and those I would say also very bravely. And so the European Central Bank is buying the public debt, the public bonds of the member state, and it doesn't respect even the threshold that was established before. So the European Central Bank is now buying around 20% of the Italian debt. So it's true that there is the European Central Bank, but for Italy is very, Italy, I think Spain, but even for France is absolutely crucial to have a larger economic strategy than just to answer nationally. Also because that would means to enter in the logic of Mr. Rutte. This is your national business. We can help you, but this is your national business. So this is also the way in which the Italian perceive the European Stability Mechanism. I think the European Stability Mechanism has been reformed dramatically by the Eurogroup of last week. However, there is always there the stigma. The European Stability Mechanism is an international organization, is come from an intergovernmental treaty outside the European Union legal order, and it has to pass continuously through the approval for any significant change of the member state national parliament. So that means in the Southern European perception that the European Stability Mechanism is a celebration of the power of the Bundestag, being Germany, the country with the higher key quota of the European Stability Mechanism capital. Germany has around 27%, Italy about 17, France 19 or 18. So basically, is Germany the most important, let's say, controller of the European Stability Mechanism? Is a German, the director of the European Stability Mechanism. Decision should be taken, generally speaking, through unanimity in the European Stability Mechanism. So it means that Germany can control any decision, and in emergency situation, decision can be taken through the majority of 85%, qualified majority 85%. So the European Stability Mechanism is the celebration of the philosophy, the culture, the view of the so-called ordoliberal approach to economic policy. And this is, I think, is now clear to everybody, at least in the South, and people don't want to accept this kind of approach. So we have one single currency, and we continue to have 19 fiscal policy, but those 19 fiscal policy are largely controlled by the more stable and creditor member state, and Germany in particular. So I wrote in several occasions that this is very dangerous also from the German point of view. To be perceived as the counterpart of the Southern European member state, Germany is worrying. Is serious. I said to my students, I went to give a lecture magistralis in Athens a few years ago, and in front of the parliament, of the Greek parliament, there was a huge figure of Angela Merkel with a mustache. So this is not this is the division.
So Sergio, thank you. I want to go
may
back.
I add one really quick comment, because
yes,
I
please,
participated.
please, of course. Of course.
And I participated in the negotiation of the ESM treaty. So I fully agree with Professor Fabbrini's view. The ESM should not be demonized but taken as it is, for what it is, an intergovernmental instrument created, governed, and financed by the member states, not the European Union. And more than problems, I would highlight its limitations, which have rightly dissuaded countries from recurring to it. First of all, the funds are far from enough to reactivate the EU's economy, already in sharp recession. It worsens the debt levels of the countries that utilize it, and it may stigmatize, as there's always a risk that the Commission will use its excessive macroeconomic imbalances procedure to enforce punitive measures on debt-ridden countries further on. And this is why distinguished economists have considered, in my opinion, rightly so, that ESM loans, sans condition or without conditions, remain somewhat of an entelechy.
So I want to go back to the questions. We have a lot of people making comments in chat. I'm going to get to all of those. Just one brief comment on what Alvaro and Sergio have been saying. I think a lot of us have been lamenting the fact that the G20 has been so inactive and showed really no leadership at the head of government level on the economic crisis and the pandemic. The G7, slightly more active, but not very impressive. On this side of the Atlantic, our economists, senior economists, are giving a lot of praise to what is working well, and that's central bank cooperation. Jerome Powell, who's a very understated figure politically here, has received glowing reviews by many, not all, but many American economists for the Fed's activity with the European Central Bank, the Canadians, the Japanese, the Chinese, the British, and these 12 swap lines that the Fed has established with other central banks that are increasing liquidity overseas and helping to stabilize economies. That seems to be working well. What's not working well is the Xi Jinping, Modi, Trump, Merkel G20. It's met once, a desultory meeting for 2 hours, no conclusions. So just a comment on that. I have Tommaso, and then I'm going to go to the questions being asked on chat, first by Bernard, then by Dr. Sumit Agarwal, and then by Sebastian Royal. So Tommaso Cariati, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question around the perception of the response. On the substance of the response, I completely agree with you. And with all of the comments you've made, to me, there was a huge failure of perception of the response as well. The example that strikes me is, the ESM that you were talking about. The EU could have easily made up a name and said, this is the special healthcare costs fund and it's free money. And instead they chose to do it within the existing treaties. Likewise, when the crisis was really bad in Italy, the first response, without any discussions on substance or any discussions on policy, was you are alone, or that was at least was the perception. Why do you think the EU struggles so much to get ahead of the story, if you wish, in journalistic terms, to on day one say, we will be there no matter what, even if the substance of the response ends up being the same?
If I can answer to that, Nick?
Please, yes, Sergio.
Okay. I would say what is lacking in Europe is the existence of an institution truly reflecting the European interest and view. I know that this is a very Madisonian view of Europe, but we don't have an institution with the power to represent the European Union. So the European Parliament is this kind of institution, but he has no power, especially in financial policy. The Commission is the outcome of a bargaining between the Parliament, the parties in the Parliament, but also and mainly the national government. Ursula von der Leyen now, 2 days ago, apologized with the Italian for not having, let's say, helped them, probably for not having understood the gravity of the crisis, but good for her to apologize. Nevertheless, she is no longer the kind of Jean Monnet, let's say, expression of the European interest as Jean Monnet thought about the Commission, probably Jacques Delors was for a while. So paradoxically, the only institution thinking European is the European Central Bank, which is the federal institution by definition in the European Union institutional system. So this is why I don't care about words. It's not the question to be federal or not federal, but it's impossible to keep a European interest without institutions that truly represent Europe. And we don't have yet this kind of institution. And this, I think, is part of the national division, national contrast, national rivalry, and also of the deep division in cultural talent that still persists in Europe.
Alvaro, at the end of the Cold War and in the run-up to Maastricht afterwards, Europe had these real giants. And Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, you referenced Jacques Delors, who was an architect of so much of this. Are the current EU leaders up to this challenge? I think Tommaso asked a good question. Politics is often about perception and effective leadership. Are we seeing it from Michel and von der Leyen?
Well, I couldn't agree more. Leadership and trust in institutions is of the essence to convey hope in times of crisis. And I mean, paraphrasing Kissinger's apocryphal quote, who does, for example, the US call in the EU to coordinate actions on COVID-19? There is not a Delors. There is not a common institutional figure, because can Trump call the Commission, von der Leyen? This option would not be entirely plausible, as the EU per se has limited powers in public health. Does the US call certain member states? This option would also be unconvincing, as member states do not have the power nor the legal mandate to coordinate measures among the rest of their peers. Does he call the President of the European Council? Not likely, because the coordinating role or lack thereof of this institution during the crisis has been harshly criticized, as has the leadership of its low-profile president. One possibility that I am currently researching on would be to promote in Europe the creation of special envoys, high representatives, or ambassadors at large, to act as references or focal points for specific crises. Of course, going back to your point, Nick, for such an exercise to work, the high representatives would need to be very high profile, respected figures with auctoritas, what the Romans called socially acknowledged wisdom and leadership, who could coordinate effectively ad intra, creating strategic unity within EU institutions and member states, as well as ad extra, acting as effective interlocutors with authorities of third-party countries. And we've had this in the past. We've had Javier Solana as a high representative. We've had, for Brexit, Michel Barnier, in a totally different context, but a very effective Mr. Brexit and a Brexit explainer to the world. And this proves that when the EU is really committed to an endeavor, it is able to deliver. So does the EU need more Barniers or Solanas? I mean, I think the question is far from rhetorical, as its importance goes well beyond transatlantic dialogue, for example. Because if the US is having trouble grasping the complex rationale and function of the EU, it could well be presumed that other great actors, such as China or Japan or India, to put some examples, may have similar issues when they try to understand the crisis management mechanisms in the EU. So I think it's, the EU faces a credibility test, not only before the US, but before the rest of the world.
Alvaro, thank you very much. I want to go to Bernard's question, Bernard Hudson. In addition to the North-South difference in perspective and response, could someone speak to the East-West differences? And I should say, as a non-European, at least when I was at NATO and in subsequent years, I felt it was really the British who understood the East Europeans well in the EU, the British now out. The British and the Americans had much closer relations with Poland and the Baltic states, I thought, than most of the other West Europeans without Britain. Is there a risk? Britain is a modulating force in Brussels. Is there a risk of an East-West cleavage in the European Union itself? Alvaro or Sergio, whichever one of you would like to take that.
I can take that. I think that there is already a West cleavage. The cleavage emerged during the migration crisis when the Commission tried to introduce some mechanism, automatic mechanism of redistribution of refugees arriving in the south of Italy or in the south of Spain, in Greece, and the so-called Visegrad group refused and opposed any such redistribution of political refugees. But that cleavage also increased in the following year because in a way, through the leadership of Viktor Orban, the Eastern European countries moved in direction that are considered by many, by myself as well, as antithetic with the DNA, with the principle constituting the European Union. So here we are facing a really radical challenge to the rule of law foundation of the European Union. And we have this challenge in a context lacking clear constitutional, let's say, safeguards. So in order to intervene on Hungary, you need to pass through a unanimity vote of the European Council, but there are other countries like the Polish government can stop, can oppose the veto to a decision stigmatizing Hungary. So we are in a trap. And at the same time, Mr. Orban is member of the main political party in the European Parliament, and that political party is important, and also the 14 representatives of the Fidesz party are important for guaranteeing the majority to von der Leyen. So we are in a trap that make difficult to have a clear position towards this illiberal trend, but in the same time, we try to keep those let's say, basic requirements as for granted. They are not granted at all. I do understand that American federalism could survive for a long period of time with pro-slavery de facto, pro-slavery state, and in any case, after the Civil War, with state that introduced very significant requirement for pushing Afro-American out of the electoral process. So this is not new. In any case, you had a constitution. We don't have any sort of this kind of document. So my opinion is that the East-West cleavage is going to increase, to deepen. And also because these, the majority of the Eastern member states are outside of the Eurozone. So they are not part of this discussion. And I would say the real battle is within the Eurozone. If the Eurozone is going to reach a level of political unity, then probably even that cleavage will be addressed directly.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Catherine Kluver has attached, if you look in the chat, the last comment, she's attached a study by the Peterson Institute in Washington. This is the Peterson Institute for International Economics and what the G20 should be doing. I think there's widespread lamentation around the world is not doing enough. Sebastian Royo's comment to Alvaro and Sergio. Sebastian says, rather than uniting us, the crisis has intensified the political divide in many of our countries. It's deepened ideological cleavages and confrontations among political parties. We're playing the blame game. What can be done to restore a sense of national purpose? That will be crucial to get over the crisis. I suppose this is, Alvaro, you need to speak about Spain's reaction here, or Sergio, Italy's reaction, rather than a European reaction, since passions are playing out in national politics.
Well, I mean, I fully agree that the whole crisis, and in particular the Corona bond dilemma, has flared up the North-South conflict in the EU. And this adds up, picking up on the previous question, to the ongoing East-West conflict as a consequence of Orban's constant defiance to the EU. Unfortunately, some share the fears of Professor Royo that the EU may end up imploding at some point as a consequence of such dialectical strife between the North and the South and the East and the West. I mean, let's hope that some of the EU leaders may heed the words of Pope Francis, who in the recent Easter Sunday Mass called for solidarity, even by resorting to innovative solutions. And once again, next Thursday's meeting, as outlined and by Professor Fabbrini, will be essential because the European Council has an institutional role. And there is a huge debate on the political nature of this institution, whether it's intergovernmental, whether it has a supranational purpose in spite of its intergovernmental formation and participants. But I truly believe that this crisis can only be dealt with at the maximum political level. So it doesn't work when the European Council defers to the Council of Ministers of Finance or the Eurogroup. I mean, it should be the other way around. I mean, we lived in the 2012, one of the most acute moments of the financial crisis when, for example, the Council of Ministers were dragging their feet on the adoption of the single supervisory mechanism. And the European Council had to step in and called upon the legislators to really roll up their sleeves and adopt a resolution, a decision to underpin the resilience and the stability of the Eurogroup. And it happened. But for this, we need political ambition. And Spain is contributing. There is this non-paper, which will be discussed on Thursday. I mean, let's see what happens with that, because there are so many cleavages, so many divisions, so many positions of sensitivity that we may well end up being victims of the consensus trap once again.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. I want to take the prerogative of the chair to call on a few people. And I'm just going to warn them ahead of time. I'd love to hear from Vivian. I'd love to hear from Jolien. I'd love to hear from Carl, because we've all been working together here in Boston, Cambridge. And here's the following question, and I don't want to force you to speak. If you'd rather not, that's perfectly fine, but I thought it'd be nice to hear from you. In class last night, I teach a class called Great Powers. We've been looking at the current balance of power in the world. Last night, I posed the following question to the students. What will the power balance be like 30 years from now, the global power balance in 2050? Which of the countries presently that have power will still have power, will be in the great power ranks? And most participants surprised me by saying 81%, the US, they thought, this is an international group of students, will still be the single strongest power, China second. That's 30 years from now. The big surprise, and Alvaro was in class last night, several students thought that Germany would be in the top 5 in the world, not the EU, but Germany, which leads to this big question we've been circling around for an hour now. Can the EU stay the course? Or will these two crises return Europe to a union of nation states? Vivian, you know more about this than I do. What do you think? You have to unmute, I think, Vivian.
Sorry. There we go.
Yeah, we hear you now.
Yep. I think that's a great question. I just want to thank both Alvaro and Sergio for wonderful talks, really deeply informed and illuminating. So I found it interesting that your class suggests that Germany will be in the top 5. And I think that that is possible only if the EU remains very strong. So exactly what Sergio was saying, that Germany actually needs the European Union just as much as the European Union needs Germany. And unfortunately, it seems to me that Northern Europeans, in particular the Netherlands right now, but also Germany, especially during the Eurozone crisis, had very little sense of how interdependent their economies were. And so long as one pushes some countries, in particular Southern Europe, to bear all the burdens as debtors, the creditors ultimately, that is the Northern Europeans, will themselves suffer. In particular at a time when we're seeing, we will be seeing, I think, a reduction of globalization and global supply chains, not entirely, but to some extent, then one needs kind of regional markets, if you will. And to the extent that if Southern Europe were to be abandoned in some sense, including through debt via the ESM, it seems to me that the Northern Europeans will be losing their export markets, just as they'll be losing China as, to some extent, as an export market. So it's in some ways, to me, it's the most shocking, but perhaps not so surprising thing is the failure of the imagination, the failure of Northern European leaders to understand that this is indeed a symmetric crisis, that the asymmetry is hitting Southern Europe first, but ultimately it will backfire. It will hit Northern Europe as well. So in 30 years hence, if Germany is seen as a great power, it is only because the EU remains itself a great organization.
And Vivian, you know I ask this as a true friend of the European Union. I am not a Trumpist in my
Indeed, of course.
towards the EU. Alvaro referenced Pope Francis, who I think he's been one of the most enlightening leaders worldwide. And he keeps saying to us, we're all in the same boat now. And that's a good admonition for Europeans. Jolyon, do you agree with Vivian, or do you have a different view?
Well, I'm in a different room, so I clearly have a different. On your question, Nick, about powers, I've used with my classes various predictions for the next 25, 30 years. And most of those predictions try to put the EU as a power, assuming it sticks together. If it doesn't stick together, then clearly the only possible one, I think, is going to be Germany, because I do now see the UK on a declining path. But that's for the future, that's 25, 30 years hence. I think the biggest, and again, I'd like Vivian to congratulate Sergio and Alvaro on a fantastically rich discussion. I think this has been absolutely riveting. I had some questions about testing and lockdown, but let me say that I, as a specialist on security and defense, have come to the unfortunate conclusion that we have to draw one lesson from this, and that is that nature is a far greater existential threat to all of us than neighbors. We've now got COVID, and I was very disappointed in the way the borders came down, as though somehow closing the borders is the solution to this. The solution is neither regional nor national. It has to be global. It can only be global. And I think that once, if we get the COVID thing sorted, the next existential threat coming up is climate. I would therefore be inclined to put a huge chunk of the defense budget into the health budget, into the climate response budgets. Those are the ways we're going to have to go, I think, with spending. And I say that as somebody who has, talked about defense spending for a very long time. I just think that we've reached a point now where we have to recognize that these threats, natural threats, disaster threats, are far more serious than the threats that we've all been talking about for so long.
Jolyon, thank you so much. I think a lot of people are wondering if the Wales commitments for 2% GDP spending by NATO allies will now be met. Most European countries were on track to meet them, with the exception of Germany. But now I think, for the reasons you cited, there are other priorities, higher priorities perhaps.
Absolutely.
Karl Kaiser, we always like to hear from you. Karl, you'll need to unmute.
I'm unmuted.
There you are. Yeah, we hear you.
Hi, Carl.
Karl, I think you're muted now.
No, I'm okay now. Can you
Okay,
hear me
now.
now?
Yep, I hear you now.
the European Union has always been a union of solidarity. I mean, when you look at the past, there were a number of countries that put more into the community, others that got something from the community. That is not new. But Vivian is completely right when she says that those who are richer owe much of that to dealing with the poorer ones. For example, Germany is of course the model case for that. What we are now facing is a qualitative jump in the demand of solidarity, which means that the European Union is now genuinely called upon to become a transfer union, something that is by law almost forbidden, but that's what's necessary. And here, the difficulty of the democratic leaders in Germany have been to convince the voters that this is necessary. Now, Angela Merkel has to some extent succeeded in doing it, and I see the signs of change in Germany in that direction. But the scope of what's necessary is so enormous that the leadership is enormously challenged to bring that about in a country which has a challenge from the extreme right now with the AfD. But I think it is happening. To come back to what Julian just said, what is also necessary is a redefinition of security. Nick, when you mentioned the 2% goal, you remember there was a debate afterwards where some, like Wolfgang Ischinger in Germany, proposed, shouldn't we redefine the share of GNP to be put on security, including non-military aspects, and then look at our budgets, such as development aid. Now we will have to add health in redefining security. It seems to me this is what the European Union and NATO should actually do in looking at the future. But the key question now, and here we come back to Germany, the key question is whether Germany, as the richest country of the North, is able to create a democratic consensus to see its role as helping others by genuinely transferring funds to the South as it has never done before. And there, well, the jury is out. One can only hope that people like Angela Merkel and all the social democratic leadership are able to do it. I don't see that on the extreme right and the extreme left. The Greens may help in this as far as Germany is concerned.
Carl, thank you very much. Really appreciate Carl, Julian, Vivian joining us, enlightening us. We're approaching the witching hour, so Alvaro and Sergio, maybe Sergio first, Alvaro the last word. Your last words to us. Are you hopeful that the European Union can surmount these twin crises and move forward and enter maybe a new phase in its history, obviously? That would be my last question to both of you. Sergio, please.
Okay, thanks. I don't know exactly how to answer to this question. I am a positivist and optimist by nature, so I always think positively about the future. But here we are witnessing, I think we have to do as much as possible to help this debate. We are witnessing a debate that is a significant debate. I don't want to use the historical character of this debate, but this is a debate without few precedent. Is this pandemic crisis a critical juncture in the European Union history? I would say more in general, in the Western experience or not. If the answer is positive, so this is a critical juncture like the 1989, 1991 Berlin Wall fall, or after the Second World War, of course, ceteris paribus as the Latin use. But if that is a critical juncture, we have to think in a different way than in the past. We are facing the unthinkable, and we cannot rely on what we know about the thinkable. So in that case, I claim the necessity of increasing solidarity among the member states of the European Union, but also I would add to that claim the necessity to create the institution of solidarity. Now, solidarity is based on political will. It is based on the capacity of the national political leadership to persuade their own electors and public opinions of the mutual advantage in helping each other, which is good. And so I found in a way positive the speech that is supposed to have said, the phrase that is supposed to have said Merkel yesterday, saying we have to move in direction of a public debt. We have to find a way because the public debt answer to our interest. If that is true, it's good. So you say to the Germans or to the Dutch, is in our interest to set up a program that can help the Southern European member state to recover. But I would make a step further. I think that that kind of approach should be enriched and strengthened by a new institution that could represent European interest, also in a moment in which you don't have at national level good leaders, as more frequently happen. So you need to have new European institutions. So now we are de facto within the Conference on the Future of Europe that was inaugurated a few months ago. And so this is a real conference. Can we say the answer to the European Union crisis is a question of policy? Yes, but we have also to answer, do we need to redefine our institutional framework? For example, giving European Union a true executive power with the resources for intervening, also if some member state national government are not ready for intervening. And that is a real jump. It doesn't matter where we go, but we have to go in the direction of making possible the preservation of national identity, national institution, national democracy, and to add to that a union level that does not prohibit national democracy to exist, indeed support national democracy, but is also independent from national democracy. And this is its own level of European Union democracy. We need to create a true union. This is the real objective, in my view, of this crisis.
Sergio, thank you so much. And one of the reasons we wanted to schedule this seminar was to hear from both of you at a critical time for the European Union, also to honor you both for being our senior fellows, visiting fellows this past semester. We're sorry it was truncated, but you contributed a lot. Sergio taught a full-length course. He's still teaching for us, entering exams in a couple of weeks on Zoom. So we really appreciate having such an eminent expert, eminent academic from Italy with us. We're hoping that your compatriot, Natalie Tocci, is going to be visiting us in the autumn if we are able to have visitors to the campus. And Alvaro, we also wanted to honor you for your senior fellowship for the entire year you've been with us. And you have been such an important part of our life at Harvard. Thank you so much. And you get the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. The honor is all mine. And as addressing your question, I believe we will overcome this crisis. Jean Monnet wrote that the EU is forged through crises. And I agree with Professor Fabbrini that the institutional framework and the whole political construct will have to be reinforced. I hope that we may live what economists, and this is something Erica and I were commenting the other day, that we may experience what economists designate creative destruction. In the midst of this crisis, creation of innovation and of mechanisms that may foster higher efficiency in decision-making processes. And with regard to the Germany issue, I believe that Germany, being the most powerful EU member state, is fully aware of the historical correlation between its prosperity, its competitiveness, its growth, its well-being, and that of the European Union as a whole. As a consequence, specifically of the single market, a strong Germany entails a strong European Union and vice versa. So, and there are important, one of the differences I've perceived now with regard to 2008 is a significant shift in public opinion, because I've read many polls, opinion polls, which indicate that a significant part of German public opinion is in favor of supporting the countries that have been hardest hit by the crisis. And this emerging, palpable feeling of solidarity is a very important political driver that will surely allow us to overcome this crisis.
Well, Alvaro, Sergio, thank you so much for your thoughts, your time, your wisdom. I just want to say, I suppose on behalf of some of the Americans here, how much we Americans rely on you. The EU remains our largest trade partner, the largest investor in our economy. Europe gives us, with Canada, our largest number of American treaty allies in the world in NATO. We are all part of the same tradition of democracy and human rights and the rule of law in a world of authoritarian powers. I'm an optimist. I actually think the EU is going to survive this crisis. It will change, just as the United States is going to change through this crisis, but we have to stick together. We are living through a time when we have the most anti-European president in the history of the United States. No one like him since Franklin Roosevelt tied us to Europe's future in the Atlantic Charter. And I'm an optimist about November 3rd, 2020. I think the United States will come back to understanding how vital Europe is to our country. I wanted to end on that note. And thank you both. And we look forward to seeing you on Zoom. And thanks to everybody. We had 115 people at one point on, still 101 sticking with us. Thanks to all of you in Europe in the afternoon. Thanks to our students. Herr Kaiser, Carl, thank you. Vivian, Jolien. And thanks very much for being with us. Bye.
Bye.